The Economist.
John Key was elected Prime Minister of New Zealand in late 2008 at the head of a centre-right coalition government. Since then, the international credit crunch has brought to an end the recovery that took effect under the previous Labour-led coalition. Mr Key faces an election in November this year. We had him in for tea when he dropped into London for the royal wedding. Mr Key, in the current economic situation, New Zealand faces quite a range of challenges, what with climbing unemployment, climbing inflation, high levels of debt. New Zealand is a very free and exposed economy, very dependent on agricultural exports, and many factors such as commodity price fluctuations, the value of the much traded Kiwi dollar, are beyond the government's control. And lately, of course, you have the cost of recovering from these two very tragic earthquakes in Christchurch. What is your government's plans for dealing with all of this, especially as you're facing an election this November?
The good news part of the equation is the government balance sheet is very strong. Debt is currently 19% of GDP. We have essentially promised the rating agencies that debt won't rise above 30% of GDP, and it's our intention to keep to that commitment. We're going into this budget on May 19 with the expectation there will be a zero budget, so no new increase in expenditure. And that is all part of ensuring that not only we don't breach our self-enforced debt targets, but also that over time we return to surplus quicker than we otherwise would, and that we start preparing the ground for what we want to see as strong economic growth. So we've been reforming most parts of the economy that will drive economic growth and lift productivity, whether it's labour market reform, taxation, investment infrastructure or skills, and we're continuing to work very aggressively on that.
Right, well the ratings agencies and the IMF have both recently put New Zealand's economy on watch. What is your reaction to that?
Yeah, so the issue there from Standard & Poor's and putting New Zealand on negative outlook is all based on the view about total indebtedness of the New Zealand economy. So what is true is that we have total indebtedness of about 85% of GDP, primarily made up because of private sector debt. The government can't control that, although it can do things to encourage a lift in national savings, and in the budget you'll see a number of initiatives to try and achieve that. Overall, we've made some changes in 2010 which we also believe would lift national savings, including increasing our consumption tax and reducing personal taxation to give people more incentives to work and to save. We've also reducing taxation on savings, and we've been discouraging savings in the housing area by eliminating depreciation claims and the likes. But longer term, that lift in national savings has to occur on the private sector side, and that is all part of the rebalancing of the economy to be much more export focused and much more outward focused.
Well, that's all very well, but this is election year, and the idea of a zero budget and austerity measures is not noted as a really successful political tactic for an election year. What do you have to say about that?
We again accept that's highly unusual. I mean, most governments go into election year offering promises of more spending and lollies and giveaways in different areas, and our view is that we want to have a mature conversation with the New Zealand public. I think we believe that they do understand that New Zealand needs to cut its cloth to the environment it finds itself in, that lumping further debt on future generations is not acceptable, that the earthquake actually does have to be paid for. So I think if you look at one of the reasons why we believe New Zealanders are ready to accept the measures that we are going to implement, that is, it can be reflected in their own pattern of behaviour. So from the period of about 2000 to 2008, what we saw was that New Zealanders were spending far more than they were earning, about $1.15 for every dollar they earned. In the last 2.5 years, they've been spending 90 cents for every dollar they've earned. So instead of just saving about 10 billion a year, they're now saving about 7 or 8 billion. Now, if collectively and en masse the New Zealand public can understand the need to get their balance sheet in order, we believe that they can understand that the government needs to do the same.
Right. The Christchurch earthquake, this has pretty much changed all the economic and political ground, and indeed the two Christchurch earthquakes. Even before these terribly tragic events took place, destroying New Zealand's second largest city and one of its major economic centres, New Zealand already had quite a lot of economic problems on its plate. Yep. How are you dealing with the aftermath?
We think there's around about $15 billion worth of either insurance or savings that we've put aside for an earthquake. That's the good news part of the story. The bad news is we think the liability for rebuilding infrastructure and housing is in the order of $20 to $25 billion. So there's a shortfall of $5 to $10 billion. We also have a reduction in tax revenue because Christchurch is our second largest city, so a contraction, such a substantial contraction in our second largest city has an impact on our accounts. By going into the budget with a zero budget, we're essentially not spending the $1 billion odd extra that we would spend. Now, because that reoccurs on every single year, over a period of about probably 7 to 10 years, you effectively pay for the earthquake.
Now, looking to the wider economic picture, we're now roughly getting on for 3 decades down the line from the huge economic reforms that took place in New Zealand in the 1980s that transformed it into one of the world's freest, most open economies. Now that we're at a time of international credit crunch, there does seem to be an argument out there that the reforms left the New Zealand economy a little too exposed. What's your view on that?
Well, I think overall, if you look at what happened as a result of those reforms, they were very necessary. I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, we had a very closed economy, and now we've gone to a very open economy, and that I think for the most part has actually been to New Zealand's benefit. I mean, I think from New Zealand's point of view, what we have realised is that while you can undertake substantial macroeconomic reform, you also have to have an attention to microeconomic reform. I think you also need to recognise that the global environment is changing. So from New Zealand's perspective, Asia is becoming increasingly more important. The integration in Asia is very important. And I think there are certain imbalances which for a long period of time we've allowed to continue, where really they need to be addressed. I mean, the current account deficit has been in deficit now for 30 odd years. We've got a situation where the savings rate has been very low for a long period of time, so we're highly reliant on foreign borrowings. There's been quite a substantial wage gap between New Zealand and Australia. It's built up over a long period of time. And while it's hard to close that gap because Australia is such a high-performing economy on the back of its mineral base, nevertheless, the government's very focused on making that happen.
Now, speaking of Australia, actually, I mean, that's something New Zealand politicians of all stripes are consistently getting themselves into a lather about, this need to close the gap with Australia to stop migration to Australia that's draining the New Zealand skills base and so forth. But it strikes me as a battle that really cannot be won because, after all, Australia is bigger and it digs a lot of things out of the ground that New Zealand simply doesn't have. I mean, bearing in mind that there are so many Australian-owned companies in New Zealand, Australia is basically one of New Zealand's major trading partners. What about the idea of just unifying with Australia?
So in that regard, I mean, Australia is our largest investor, it's our largest market for exports, it's our largest market for tourists and the like. So in that regard, Australia is critically important to New Zealand. And in fact, as much as we could catch Australia, arguably with a weaker Australia, that would be to the detriment of New Zealand. Obviously, we are concerned about the number of university graduates that go across the Tasman and the cost of the taxpayer to educate those people and the loss of skills and capital that goes with that. So, look, we have to have that ambition. I think we can make gains. In an after-tax real wage perspective, we have been closing that gap, but we acknowledge there's a lot more work to be done.
And China's been mentioned as New Zealand's future, really. It's buying a lot more New Zealand commodities. Under your predecessor, New Zealand was the first developed country in the world to sign a free trade agreement with China. Is New Zealand's future more and more Chinese?
I think they're going to play an integral part in our economic growth story. From New Zealand's point of view, we are rapidly growing. So in 2010, two-way trade was 10 billion New Zealand dollars with China. I've agreed with Wen Jiabao that we will have an objective of doubling that by 2015, and we're on track to do that. And I think that naturally is because China represents a huge market, and New Zealand represents a country that they want to buy goods from, particularly on the agricultural space. So I think that they are a big part of our future. The other thing that of course makes them interesting is that they're a big part of Australia's future as well. And as I said earlier, a strong Australia is a strong New Zealand arguably. So we do see them as being very important.
Very quickly, looking at the New Zealand coalition government system, your coalition in particular, just recently there's been a change at the top of one of your coalition partners, the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, where the new leader is now to be Don Brash. In fact, your predecessor is leader of the National Party. What does this change, this major change in your coalition partner, mean for the potential ability to form a coalition should you win the election in November? I
don't think it means a great deal. I mean, ACT have always had an extreme right-wing doctrine as the founding philosophy of that party. And it has an appeal. It's typically had an appeal to quite a narrow audience in New Zealand. And my view is that it will continue to have an appeal, but to a relatively narrow slice of the voting population in New Zealand. So look, if we're in a position to put together a government post-November 26, which is election day, then we'll look to work with other political parties. But it's my intention as Prime Minister, if I continue to be so, to run a government along the lines that we have in the past, which is a moderate centre-right government, a reforming government where we want to lift productivity. We're very focused on getting the Crown accounts back into order and back into surplus. We are focused on lifting the performance of the country, but we also want to take people with us. And I think if you look at the dislocation that happened from the reforms back in the late 80s and early 90s, it was a very different time in New Zealand's history. I don't think we face the same challenges, which is not to say we don't face considerable challenges, we do, but we need to address those in a different way.
Thank you very much for coming in for Tea with The Economist.
Thanks very much.
Mr Key's mission is to convince New Zealanders that his austere approach in an election year is the right one. This is bound to prove challenging. However, so far, the opinion polls suggest he is succeeding. Yet much could change between now and November, when the election is scheduled to take place.
The Economist.